The day I found out my father died poor while the family I married into spent 20 years living off his money, I did not cry. I did not scream. I sat on the floor of his study, holding a piece of paper that explained everything, and I felt the quietest, most devastating kind of anger I have ever felt in my entire life. Because the worst part was not the theft. The worst part was that my husband knew, and his mother had made sure from the very beginning that I never would. That is where this story starts. Not at the wedding, not at the funeral. It starts on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks after we buried my father, when I went back to his house alone and found a folder he had hidden inside an old prayer book. A folder that did not just reveal a theft. A folder that revealed a plan. And the most painful part of that plan was this. The plan was me. Stay with me. Because what I found in that folder did not just change my understanding of a property or a partnership or a fraudulent document. It changed my understanding of every warm smile, every careful question, every soft word of welcome I had ever received from the people I thought were my family. And by the time this story is finished, you will understand exactly why I stopped begging for their love and started letting the truth speak for itself. Before I tell you what was inside that folder, I want to ask you something. If the person you loved and chose and built your life beside had known that his family was hiding something enormous about your dead father and had said nothing every single morning for 4 years, what would you call that? Cowardice? Loyalty to the wrong people? Or something darker? I want you to think about that question while you listen, because I had to answer it for myself, and my answer is part of this story. Drop it in the comments. I read them, and I want to know where you land. My father was the kind of man who saved everything. Not money. He never seemed to have much of that, or so I believed for most of my life. But he saved paper. Letters, receipts, birthday cards, old newspaper clippings. School reports with my name on them from 1997. A handwritten grocery list in my mother's handwriting from the year before she passed. His study was a museum of every important thing that had ever happened in his quiet life, filed into folders, stacked into boxes, held together with rubber bands that had gone brittle and cracked with age. When he died, my husband Daniel suggested we hire a clearance company. He said it gently, in the soft and caring voice he used whenever he was steering me somewhere without wanting me to feel steered. He said I was grieving, and that I did not need to go through all of that alone. He said his mother had already offered to help organize the estate. He said it all within 3 days of the funeral, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table and thinking how thoughtful he was. How fortunate I was to have married someone who wanted to protect me from pain. I agreed to let the clearance company come, and then, 2 weeks later, something stopped me. I cannot tell you exactly what it was. It might have been a daughter's instinct. It might have been the memory of my father's voice, the way he used to say, "Sarah, the truth is always in the paper. Always write it down." Whatever it was, I drove to his house alone on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after we buried him, and I walked into his study before the clearance company arrived. The folder was inside an old Quran on the 3rd shelf, tucked between the back cover and the binding, pressed flat and careful, like something precious, like something hidden deliberately, like something a man put somewhere safe because he does not know who to give it to, but he cannot bring himself to throw it away. I pulled it out. I sat down on the floor in the middle of that room that smelled like him, like old paper and cedar wood and the particular quiet of a life lived simply and honestly. And I started reading. What I found inside that folder would take me 6 months to fully understand. But the first document I saw, I understood immediately. It was a property deed, dated 1998, and printed clearly on the second page, listed as a 40% co-owner of a commercial property on Fairview Road, was my father's name. Karim Hassan, 40%. I read it 3 times, then I looked at the address, then I sat very still for a long time. Because I knew that address. Fairview Road was the address of the property that had formed the cornerstone of my husband's family business. The property that Daniel's mother, Margaret, talked about with a kind of quiet pride that I had always taken as natural confidence. The property that I had heard described at family dinners as the foundation of everything they had built. The property that Margaret had sold the previous year for a sum she never shared with me, but that Daniel had let slip once, in a moment of unguarded pride, was over 4 million due. Lars. My father's name was on that deed, 40%. My father, who died in a rented house, who wore the same heavy coat for 11 winters because he said it was still perfectly good, who told me not to worry about his savings because he was honest that he did not have much, who never once in my memory bought himself something unnecessary, owned 40% of a property worth over $4 million. And nobody had ever told me. Nobody had ever told him it had been taken. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to. I need to explain who Daniel is, so you understand why what I had just found felt like standing in a room where the ceiling had collapsed without making a sound. Because the wrongness of it was not just the theft. It was the person connected to it. I met Daniel 11 years ago at a professional conference. He was charming in a specific way that I had not often encountered, the kind of charm that pays attention. He remembered that I took my coffee without sugar. He remembered, weeks later, that I had mentioned my father's name in passing once during a conversation about work and family, and he asked about him at our second meeting like it was the most natural thing in the world. I was careful with people then, especially careful with men who seemed too smooth. I had been careful for years. But Daniel felt like someone who was genuinely paying attention, not performing attention, and there is a difference, and I believed I could tell the difference. We dated for 3 years before we married. In those 3 years, I met his family completely. His mother, Margaret, a composed and well-dressed woman who had managed the family's property business with the confidence of someone who had never seriously been questioned and who did not intend to start. His older brother, Richard, quiet and deliberate, who handled the legal and financial side of the business. His younger sister, Elaine, who was warm in the way that slightly unmoored people are warm, always generous with feeling, but always deferring to her mother on anything that required a decision. Margaret welcomed me from the beginning. She was gracious in a way that felt genuine. She told me she was glad Daniel had found someone with a good head on her shoulders. She said that more than once over those years, and I thought it was a compliment. I thought she recognized something real in me, something she respected. Now I understand what she actually recognized. She saw someone without lawyers in her family. She saw someone who did not have business advisors or financial consultants or a network of people who would look at her family's empire and start asking questions. She saw someone who was alone in the specific way that made her manageable. I was the daughter of one man, and that man was gone. I had no one standing behind me to ask the right questions. I was exactly the kind of woman Margaret could welcome without fear. And I did not understand that until I was sitting on a floor reading a document that told me why she had never been afraid of me. I went through the rest of the folder slowly, handling each page like something that could dissolve if I moved too fast. The second document was a letter, handwritten by my father, addressed to a man named James Hartley, dated 2003. James Hartley was Daniel's father. He had passed away 8 years ago, 2 years before Daniel and I married, which meant I had never met him and never had the chance to ask him a single question. In the letter, my father wrote calmly, without accusation, without anger, which told me more about his character than anything I could say. He wrote that he had been patient. He wrote that it had been 5 years since they had purchased the Fairview Road property together, and that in 5 years he had not received any accounting of the rental income it had been generating. He wrote that he was not accusing James of anything. He wrote explicitly that he trusted him. He wrote that he only wanted to understand when they might sit down and review the numbers together as partners. He wrote that he had invested his life savings in that property, $85,000, 15 years of working and saving and going without, and he had given it all to James Hartley for a partnership he believed in. He signed the letter, "Your friend Karim." Your friend. I had to set that letter down on the floor and breathe for a while, because my father had written to the man who was in the process of stealing everything from him and called him his friend. Because he had trusted so completely, had been so genuinely good, that he could not bring himself to use an accusing tone in a letter that was, in fact, describing a theft in progress. He kept his faith in a man who did not deserve one more day of it. I know exactly where I got that quality from, And for the first time in my adult life, I felt the full weight of being my father's daughter, and the weight of it was enormous. There were more documents. I did not rush. The third document was a bank statement from August of 1998, my father's personal account. I could see his balance before and after a single withdrawal. Before the date, 87,000 and some change. The careful accumulation of a careful man. After the date, $2,000. And the withdrawal description read, Fairview Property Investment, JH Partnership. He had given everything he had. Every dollar he had earned and set aside across 15 years of modest living. He had handed it to James Hartley in good faith and in friendship. And he had gone home with $2,000 left to his name, believing he now owned 40% of something that would grow and be his legacy. The fourth document stopped my breath completely. It was a transfer agreement, dated 2001, 3 years after the purchase. And according to that document, my father had agreed to transfer his entire 40% share of the Fairview Road property to James Hartley for a stated consideration of $1. $1. And below the typed text was a signature that was supposed to be my father's name. I stared at that signature for a very long time. I had seen my father sign his name across my entire life. Thousands of times. The particular angle of the K at the beginning, the way it connected to the rest. The H that always sat fractionally lower than the letters beside it. The quick finishing loop on the end that he made in one fluid movement without lifting the pen. This signature was close. It was practiced. Someone had worked on it, but it was not right. The K was too upright. The loop at the end was too careful, the way a copy looks when someone is concentrating on reproducing a shape rather than writing a name they have written 10,000 times without thinking. My father had not signed that document. I was as certain of that as I was of my own name. And if he had not signed it, then the transfer had never legally happened. And if the transfer had never legally happened, then his 40% of that property had always been his. Through every year of rental income. Through the sale the previous year for $4,260,000. Through all of it. 40% of that sale was $1,704,000. $1,704,000. That was the number sitting in that folder. That was what had been taken from my father. That was what had been built into the walls of Margaret's gracious house and Richard's business and Daniel's easy life, and the warm welcome that had felt so genuine when I walked into that family 11 years ago. I sat on the floor of my father's study for almost 2 hours that morning. Then I photographed every document, every page, front and back. I put the folder back inside the prayer book. I put the prayer book in my bag. I left before the clearance company arrived. I drove home and I sat in the driveway for a long time. And then I made a decision that I believe saved everything that came after. I did not say a single word to Daniel. Not that evening, not that week, not for the 6 weeks that followed. Because I had just learned something about the world I was living in. I had learned that the people closest to me were capable of hiding something enormous, and that they were capable of making things disappear if they knew I had found them. The documents were not safe yet. I was not ready, and so I chose silence. Not the silence of someone who is afraid. The silence of someone who has just started paying very close attention. You need to understand what those 6 weeks were like, because it was not dramatic. It was ordinary life on the surface. Dinner at the table. Television in the evening. Morning routines. And underneath all of it, a complete unraveling of everything I thought I had understood. Daniel was attentive during that period. Noticeably so. He asked often whether I had finished going through my father's house. He asked whether there was anything significant in the paperwork. He asked it in the careful, indirect way that people use when they are looking for a specific answer to a specific question without wanting to reveal that they have a specific question. He was warm while he asked. He brought it up gently over dinner, framed as concern for me. Are you okay? I know going through his things must be hard. Did you find anything that needs dealing with? I told him the house was mostly sorted and there was nothing significant. I watched his face while I said it. He relaxed, barely, just a small release of something around the eyes and jaw, just enough. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. Daniel was looking for something. He knew there was something to find. And when I told him I had found nothing, he was relieved. The week after that, Margaret called. She said she wanted to offer to accompany me to my father's house for the final walkthrough before the lease ended. She framed it the way she always framed her management, as kindness. She said she was thinking of me. She said going through someone's belongings alone was a heavy thing to do. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, I was only worried you might find some of his old papers confusing. Things from before your time. I wrote that phrase down in my notebook the moment I ended the call. Things from before your time. Because that is not something you say to a grieving daughter going through a dead man's belongings unless you already know something specific is in those belongings. That is not comfort. That is a preemptive explanation for a document she was afraid I might have already seen. Margaret was scared. The woman who had managed everything with such effortless authority for as long as I had known her was scared. And her fear told me more than any document could. I began researching carefully, in places and on devices that were not connected to Daniel or our shared life. At my office during lunch breaks. At the public library in a town 40 minutes away on Saturday mornings when I told Daniel I was shopping. I used a personal email account I had created specifically for this. I did not use our home computer. I know that sounds extreme. I want to explain why it was not. I was living in a house with someone who was connected by blood and loyalty to a family that had already demonstrated they were capable of extraordinary and sustained deception. Carelessness was not an option I had. I found the public property records for Fairview Road. Property transactions are public record, and this was no different. The original purchase from 1998 listed two owners, James Arthur Hartley and Karim Mohammed Hassan, 60% and 40% respectively. My father's 40% was confirmed in the public register. The 2001 transfer was also there, recorded, filed, accepted by the registry office, and recorded as submitted by an agent acting on behalf of the Hartley family interest. The Hartley family had filed that document, not my father, not his representative. The family that benefited from the transfer had submitted it to the registry. My father had never been to that registry office. He had never known the transfer was filed. He had continued writing patient letters asking about his share years afterward, which meant he had no idea the paper had been filed claiming he had already given it away. I found the 2022 sale record, $4,260,000, 40% of which was $1,704,000. I sat with those numbers, and I did the only thing I knew how to do with feelings that large, which was to put them somewhere quiet and keep working. I found a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone from our area who might know someone who knew the Hartley family or their solicitors. I found a specialist in property litigation and inheritance fraud, a woman practicing in a city 40 minutes away named Patricia Osei. She had a reputation, verifiable through professional directories and publicly available case summaries, for handling exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered claim that involves both civil fraud and inheritance questions. I emailed her from my new account. I told her I had documents relating to a potentially fraudulent property transfer involving my late father's estate. I asked if she could meet. She replied the same day. We met the following Thursday morning in her office. I brought printed photographs of every document from the folder. Patricia looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up. She said, "This is a serious matter, Sara." And she said it in the way that serious people say serious things, without drama, without performance, which meant she meant every word of it. She said, "The law is potentially very much on your side here, but you need to understand that when this comes to light, the people involved will not respond calmly." She told me 3 things that I held onto like anchors across everything that followed. The first was that a fraudulent transfer, if proven, could be voided, which would restore my father's legal ownership position to him as of the date of purchase. And as his sole heir, that position would pass to me. The second was that forging a signature on a legal document and submitting it to a government registry was not just a civil matter. It was a criminal one. Someone had committed fraud, and the question of who was a separate investigation that could run alongside the civil claim. The third was that the property had been sold the previous year while my father was, if the transfer was void, still legally a co-owner. The sale proceeds had been distributed incorrectly. I had a potential claim on those funds. At the end of the meeting, Patricia asked me one more question. She asked it quietly and carefully. She said, "Sara, you mentioned your husband's family. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer it honestly, because the answer will affect how we proceed and how we protect you personally. Did your husband know about this before you married him?" I thought about Daniel's face relaxing at the dinner table. I thought about Margaret's voice on the phone. Things from before your time. I thought about the way his mother had always and specifically encouraged our relationship when she had a known history of discouraging his previous ones. I said I did not know with certainty, but I believed he did. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If he knew, Sara, this is not only a property case. This is a marriage that may have been partly built around a concealment, and that significantly changes your personal legal position in addition to everything else." That night I made dinner. I set the table. I asked Daniel about his day. He told me about a meeting he'd had. He asked about mine and I said it had been fine. We watched something on television. We went to bed. And I lay in the dark beside my husband of 4 years and thought about the fact that I had spent that afternoon with a solicitor who was preparing a fraud case against his family. I did not sleep well, but I did not cry either. I had moved through the crying phase somewhere in the weeks between finding the folder and sitting in Patricia's office. The grief had transformed into something more functional, something that moved forward rather than staying in one place. I had learned something from my father, I think. He had stayed too long in patience and trust. I loved him for it. I also knew I was his daughter, and that the best thing I could do with that inheritance was to carry his honesty without carrying his silence. Patricia needed corroboration for the forgery claim. Photographs of documents were powerful, but she wanted independent analysis of the signatures. And she wanted to find anyone with direct knowledge of the original 1998 transaction. She suggested we look for the solicitor who had handled the original property purchase. A transaction of that nature would have involved a lawyer, and a lawyer would have records. She began making professional inquiries through channels I was not fully party to, which was fine. That was exactly what I was paying her to do. It took 2 weeks to locate him. Retired now, living in a quiet small town 2 hours away, a man named Gerald Henley who had practiced property law for 30 years and still, his former clerk told Patricia's assistant, kept paper files on everything because he did not trust digital records. He drove to meet him on a Saturday. He was in his 70s, white-haired and precise in his speech, the kind of man who still wore a pressed shirt on a Saturday and who clearly found sloppiness of any kind faintly offensive. When Patricia described the transaction, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said 2 names out loud, calmly and without prompting. He said Karim Hassan and James Hartley. And then he looked at me. And he said, "You're Karim's daughter, aren't you? You have the same look around the eyes." I had to take a breath. I told him yes. He sat back. He said he had often wondered if this day would come. And he said it in the way that told me the wondering had not been idle, that there had been something specific he had carried. He told us what he remembered. He said that in 1998, he had handled the Fairview Road purchase for both men. He had drawn up the partnership deed, the property agreement, the co-ownership documentation, all of it. He said my father had been a careful and thoughtful client who asked good questions and read everything before he signed anything. He said James Hartley had been charming and quick and very comfortable with the process, the kind of client who signed without reading because he already knew what he wanted the documents to say. He said that in 2001, an intermediary had contacted his office requesting copies of the original partnership documents for what was described as a routine review. He had provided copies, standard practice. He had not been contacted again. He said he had become aware, years later, that a transfer document had been filed and recorded, effectively vesting the full ownership in James Hartley. He said it had troubled him. But he was retired by then, had no ongoing relationship with either client, and had no legal standing to act on a private concern. Then he said the thing that made Patricia, a woman I had come to understand was not easily moved, go very still. He said, I keep my original files, everything from every transaction. I have the 1998 partnership deed and all associated signature pages. If there is a later document purporting to bear Karim Hassan's signature, I can tell you very quickly whether the two signatures were made by the same person. He opened a cabinet and retrieved a folder, his copy of the original 1998 deed, my father's real signature, Whitney. As said, notarized, dated. Patricia placed the photograph of the 2001 transfer document beside it. Gerald Henley looked at both for perhaps 30 seconds, not a long time. Then he looked up and said, with the precision of someone who spent 30 years reading documents, these were not written by the same hand. The 2001 document does not carry Karim Hassan's signature. Something settled in me in that moment that had not been settled. I had known. I had been certain. But there is an enormous difference between knowing something in your bones and having a credentialed, experienced professional say it plainly in front of others. My father had not given away his share. He had not sold it for $1 to his partner of 3 years. He had not agreed to any of it. It had been taken from him, while he continued to write patient letters asking when they might sit down together and look at each other. On the drive home, Patricia was quiet. Then she said, Sara, I want you to prepare for what you're doing. Once we file, it becomes a matter of public record. Once the defendants are served, the Hartley family will know everything, and they will tell you everything. So before we file, you have a decision to make. Do you tell Daniel first, or do you let events reveal his position without giving him time to I thought about that for 2 days. I thought about love and what it is not, and what it cannot survive, and what it should not have to survive. I thought about my father, who trusted so completely and was so good that he called a thief his friend. I thought about what it cost him. I told Patricia to file. The papers were served on a Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, my phone rang and it was Margaret. She did not shout. Margaret never shouted. Shouting is for people who do not know how to make the person in front of them feel that they are the problem. She spoke in the voice of someone patiently correcting a misunderstanding. She said she thought we should talk. She said there seemed to be some confusion about her late father-in-law's partnership with my father. She said she completely understood that grief could lead a person to read old documents in a way that wasn't quite accurate. I let her finish. Then I said, Margaret, I have a retired solicitor named Gerald Henley who handled the original transaction in 1998 and who has compared the signatures from that document to the 2001 transfer and confirmed they are not the same hand. I have a forensic document examiner commissioned independently who is currently completing a formal analysis. And I have a legal team. I don't believe this is a confusion. The pause that followed was not a polite one. It was the pause of a person who has just discovered that the ground they were standing on is no longer where they thought it was. She said she would need to speak with her son. I said I thought that was a good idea. Daniel came home that evening looking like a person I had not quite seen before. Not the man who remembered small things. Not the man who framed his steering as protection. He looked like someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and had found on the drive home that none of the rehearsed words worked. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. He said, Sara, you filed a legal claim against my family. I said I filed a legal claim on behalf of my father's estate. He said that is the same thing. I said, is it? Explain to me how those two things are the same thing, Daniel. What followed was the most honest conversation we had ever had in our marriage. Not because Daniel chose honesty for its own sake, but because the space for careful management had run out and he was standing in the truth whether he wanted to be or not. He said he had known. Not the full picture, he said. Not the forgery. But he had known that there was some kind of prior arrangement between his father and my father regarding the Fairview Road property, and that his mother had described it as an old business matter that had been settled long ago. He said he had not asked for details because in his family, asking certain questions was understood to have a cost, and he had learned not to pay that cost. He said his mother had encouraged our relationship. I made him say that part again. He said it again. His mother had told him, early in the time we were dating, that she thought I was a wonderful woman and that he should be serious about pursuing things with me. I looked at him. I said, "Daniel, your mother is known in your family for having strong opinions about the women in your life. You have told me stories about previous partners she discouraged. In 4 years of being her daughter-in-law, I have seen her dismiss people she considered unsuitable without hesitation. She encouraged this one. Did you ever, even once, ask yourself why?" He was very quiet. I said, "I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it without thinking a boo. How the answer will sound. Did your mother ever say anything to you, at any point, about my father's connection to the Fairview property in the context of our relationship? In the context of you and me?" He looked at the table. A long time passed. Then he said, "She said it was better to have you close than to have the past come up from the outside." Have you close? 9 words. There was the whole of it. His mother had not welcomed me because she liked me. She had not encouraged our relationship because she recognized something admirable in me. She had welcomed me because I was the daughter of the man whose money sat in the walls of their property, and a daughter inside the family, dependent and grateful, and without resources to ask questions, was a far safer situation than a daughter on the outside who might one day start looking. If I ever found anything, I could be dismissed as confused. If I ever pushed, they could threaten the marriage. If I was busy being a wife, I was not being an investigator. And my husband who remembered how I took my coffee, who asked about my father with such apparent warmth, who had been so attentive in those 6 weeks after I went to the house. He had known there was something. He had known the ground was uneven. He had chosen, every single morning for 4 years, to say nothing. I asked Daniel to leave for the night. He argued briefly. Then he looked at my face and he picked up his keys. That night I called Patricia and told her what Daniel had said. She said it was significant information. She said it supported a broader picture of intentional concealment that could be relevant to several aspects of the case. Then she said, quietly, "Sara, you are handling this with extraordinary composure." I told her I did not feel composed. I told her I felt like someone who had just discovered that the house they had lived in for years was built on stolen ground, and that everyone who handed them the keys had known. She said, "Yes, but you're still standing. And right now, that is the only thing that matters." In the weeks that followed, the Hartley family's solicitors filed a response claiming the 2001 transfer was legitimate and voluntary, that my father had willingly sold his share for fair consideration, and that the claim was a product of grief and misunderstanding. They used the word frivolous. Patricia submitted Gerald Henley's formal declaration. She submitted the report from an independent forensic document examiner, who concluded with high confidence that the signature on the 2001 transfer was inconsistent with the authenticated signature from the 1998 deed. She submitted the letter my father had written to James Hartley in 2003, asking about the accounts, which demonstrated clearly that 5 years after the alleged transfer, my father still believed himself to be a partner in the property. He had not known it was gone because he had not given it away. She also submitted the registry filing record, which showed that the 2001 transfer had been submitted to the registry office not by my father or any representative of his, but by an agent acting for the Hartley family. My father had never initiated any action at the registry. He had never authorized any representative to act for him in a transfer he did not know about. The other side went quiet for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, they tried other approaches, not legal ones, personal ones. Richard called me. He was businesslike in the way that men are businesslike when they are trying to make a human situation into a transactional one, because transactions have conclusions that feelings do not. He used words like practical and forward-looking, and he talked about family harmony in the tone of someone who had decided that family harmony was a thing I owed him. He said whatever had happened between the two fathers was between those two men, a long time ago, and surely we could find a way to resolve this without things becoming any more difficult than they already were. I told him I was happy to receive any settlement proposal through my solicitor. He said, "Sara, do you understand what you're doing to Daniel?" I said, "Richard, I want to ask you something. Do you understand what was done to my father?" He did not answer. I said, "Anything through my solicitor, thank you," and I ended the call. Elaine sent a long message that night, softer than her brother's call. She said she didn't fully understand everything that had happened, but that she could see I was hurting and she wanted me to know she cared about me as a person. She said the family was frightened. She said Daniel was broken. She said she hoped there was some way through all of this. I replied to Elaine because she was the one person in that family about whom I had never formed a suspicious thought, and I still didn't. I told her I could hear how painful her position was and that I bore her no anger. I told her what I was doing was not about destroying anything. It was about restoring something that had been taken. She was quiet for several days. When she responded, she said only, "I believe you, Sara. I am so sorry." That message was small, and it mattered more than she probably knew. Because when you are in the middle of something that costs you everything you thought you had, even one person saying simply, "I believe you," can be the difference between feeling completely alone and feeling like you can continue. Margaret did not contact me. Not once. Not a message. Not through Elaine or anyone else. Complete silence from the woman who had, in 4 years of my marriage, sent me birthday messages and called to ask how I was and brought flowers when I was unwell. The warmth had evaporated entirely the moment I was no longer contained. There was no overlap, no remnant, no grace period. I had been useful and now I was not, and she saw no reason to continue the performance. I found that clarifying rather than devastating. It is a specific kind of gift, actually, when someone removes every possible remaining doubt about what your relationship with them actually was. It releases you from the question. You stop wondering whether there was something real underneath. There was not. And once you know there was not, you stop grieving it and you redirect that energy somewhere that can actually use it. The forensic analysis came back in full. The conclusion was not ambiguous or qualified or conditional. The signature on the 2001 transfer document was a forgery. The examiner used specific technical language about stroke patterns and pen pressure, and the particular characteristics of handwriting that cannot be successfully reproduced by someone who did not form those habits over a lifetime. The summary, for a non-expert, was clear. The signature was not made by the person whose name it bore. Patricia filed an amended claim that explicitly referenced criminal fraud and requested that the matter be referred to the relevant authorities for investigation alongside the civil proceedings. The Hartley family's existing legal firm withdrew from the case within 4 days of that filing. They hired a new firm. The new firm immediately requested a 4-week extension to prepare their response. In the middle of that extension, Margaret Hartley came to our house. She arrived on a Sunday morning when Daniel was home. No phone call, no message. She simply appeared at the door in a good coat, as if she were arriving for a family lunch. She asked to speak with me. Daniel looked between us with an expression I recognized as fear. Not the fear of someone afraid for someone else. The fear of someone who knew what was in the room and was afraid of what would come out of it. I told him I was fine and to give us a moment. He went upstairs with the slow movements of someone who was not sure they were doing the right thing, but also was not sure they had the right to stop anything anymore. Margaret sat across from me in my living room. She was perfectly composed. She folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at me with the expression of a woman who had spent 7 decades winning through studies. She said, "Sara, I think we both know that whatever happened between your father and James was complicated. Business partnerships involve trust, and sometimes things are not documented the way they should be. Men made decisions in those years that did not always make it into the proper paperwork. I want you to think about what you are doing to this family, to Daniel, to yourself. You have a life here. You have people who care about you here. Is a legal battle worth losing all of that?" I let her finish completely. Then I said, "Margaret, my father saved his money for 15 years. He gave it all to your husband because he trusted him and called him his friend. He wrote letters for years asking when they would look at the accounts together, and he never received a real answer. He died in a rented house wearing the same coat he had worn for 11 winters, believing he had nothing, while the money he invested was sitting in your property-generating income and then sold for over $4 million. I want you to understand what I hear when you use the word complicated. I hear you telling me that complicated is supposed to be a sufficient explanation for what was done to my father's life. And it is not. It is nowhere near sufficient. She was still. I said, I am not doing this to hurt Daniel. I am doing this because my father never had anyone to do it for him. He trusted too much and he was too patient and too good, and when someone like that is taken from, they deserve to have someone stand up afterward and say so. I am doing this because the truth is in the paper. He always told me that. And the paper says he was owed something, and he never got it. That is not complicated. That is a very simple thing that happened to a very honest man. She stood. She smoothed her jacket with both hands in the unhurried way of someone W. Ho does not want to appear rushed. She walked to the door. She turned once and said, I hope you understand what you are choosing. I said, I hope you understand what you chose, 20 years ago. She left. I sat for a while after she left. Then I cried. Not from sadness exactly, and not from anger. From the specific release of having finally let the truth out of the room where I had been keeping it contained. The way a word you have been holding back for a long time feels when you finally say it out loud. You have to sit with the aftermath of your own honesty. It takes something out of you and puts something else back in. Daniel came downstairs. He had heard enough of it. He stood in the doorway looking at me with the expression of a man who has run out of ways to position himself in the middle. He said, Sara, I am sorry for all of it, for what my family did, for what I didn't ask, for what I let happen. I looked at my husband of 4 years, the man I had chosen. I thought about everything we had been to each other, the parts that had been real, the parts I still believed had been real, and the enormous shadow that sat behind all of it. I said, Daniel, I need you to be honest with me, more honest than you have been since all of this began. When you asked me to marry you, did you love me? He said yes, without hesitating. I said, when your mother told you it was better to have me close, what did you tell her? He looked at the floor. He said, I told her I wasn't doing it for that reason. I told her I loved you and that was why. I said, did she believe you? He said, I don't think she cared, Sara. As long as the result was the same, it didn't matter to her why I was doing it. I nodded slowly. I said, that's the thing I can't find a way around. Not that she used the situation, but that you knew she was using it and you stayed quiet. Every morning you woke up next to me, you knew there was a shadow over my father's history with your family. You knew there was something that was being managed, even if you told yourself you didn't know the details. And you chose your family's quiet over my right to know the truth about my own. He had no answer, because there was no answer. There are some choices that you make by not making any choice at all, and those are the ones that are hardest to come back from. The civil case proceeded. The criminal referral was accepted, and a formal investigation began. I will not describe that process in detail, because some of it is still ongoing, and I have no interest in compromising anything. What I will say is that the referral created consequences that were both significant and, in some ways, broader than I had planned for. Margaret Hartley, as the administrator of James Hartley's estate, became the central figure of investigation into who had submitted the forged transfer document to the registry in 2001. That question was now being asked by people with the authority to compel answers. Richard, who had managed the business's legal affairs since his 20s, retained his own separate legal counsel almost immediately after the criminal referral was announced. He did not share counsel with his mother. The decision to retain separate representation, in the context of a family business, is a very specific kind of signal. It says, I am no longer certain that my interests and your interests are the same thing. I want to be very clear about what is mine and what is not. The family's property company accounts, as they related to the Fairview Road property income, were subject to a financial review. This was not something I had specifically sought. It was a downstream consequence of the criminal referral. The law, once you set it in motion in the right direction, does not always stay exactly where you aimed it. It finds what it finds. Across this entire period, I watched the Hartley family differently than I had ever watched them before. Not with hatred. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters to say what the emotion actually was, and it was not hatred. It was a kind of sorrowful clarity. The way you feel when you see something you have been looking at for years suddenly in the right light and realize you had always been seeing it slightly wrong. I watched Margaret in the period before our confrontation, at the few family occasions where I was still present, and I noticed the way she always controlled the narrative around the Fairview property. When it came up in family conversation, which it did occasionally as a piece of the family's founding story, she told a particular version of events. James had found the property. James had developed it. James had built something lasting and she had honored it. My father's name never appeared in that story. Not once in 4 years of family dinners had I heard my father named in connection with that property. I had never had any reason to think he should be. I watched Richard, and I understood now why his answers about property history had always been brief and redirecting. I had thought he was simply a private person who did not like discussing business at the dinner table. Now I understood he was a careful person who knew where the edges of certain conversations were and made sure they did not go past them. I watched Elaine, and I thought about whether her vagueness about financial matters was genuine or engineered, whether Margaret had kept her uninformed as a kind of protection. An unknowing family member is a useful buffer. They can say truthfully that they don't know, and their genuine confusion reads as innocence because it is. And I watched Daniel. I had become, across these weeks, a very acute reader of Daniel. I noticed the way he positioned himself as my protector in all things connected to my grief and my father and anything that might take me toward those documents, always offering to help, to handle, to spare me. I had experienced that as love for 4 years. Now I experienced it as management that had the texture of love. Patricia called 6 months after the initial filing with the settlement offer from the other side. She described it carefully and without inflection, which was how she delivered important information. The offer was $1,450,000, framed as a full and final settlement. No admission of wrongdoing, confidentiality clause, standard construction for a case of this kind, she said. And she said she believed we could do better on both the number and the terms. I told her to counter. I told her what I wanted that no amount of money could give me, but that I was going to ask for anyway. I said, I want a clause in the settlement document that formally acknowledges Karim Mohammed Hassan as a co-owner of the Fairview Road property from the date of purchase in 1998 until his death. I want his name in the official record. I don't need the word fraud. I don't need anyone accused in the settlement terms. I need my father to exist in the document that closes this case. I need the paper to say his name. Patricia was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said she would make that the non-negotiable condition. It took 6 more weeks of back and forth, but they agreed. The final settlement was $1,620,000, and it contained a clause that formally acknowledged Karim Mohammed Hassan as a co-owner of the Fairview Road property from the date of the original purchase agreement in August 1998 until his death. My father was in the record. He had always been there. Now the paper said so. And paper, as he had always told me, is where the truth lives. I want to tell you what the day of the finalized settlement actually felt like. Because I think if you are listening to this expecting triumph, I want to tell you what actually happened in my body and my mind on that day. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel a clean and ringing victory. What I felt was something much quieter. A very specific kind of settling, like a thing that has been off balance for a long time finding its correct position at last. Not celebration. Rightness. The deep and particular rightness of a truth being placed where it belongs. I drove to the cemetery. It was a cold afternoon with flat gray light. I sat at my father's grave for a long time. I told him what had happened. I told him that his name was now in the official record of the Fairview Road property. I told him that the investment he had made with his life savings, the 40% he had trusted to a friend, had finally been acknowledged in a legal document that would exist for as long as legal documents exist. I told him I was sorry it had taken so long. I told him I wished he had been alive to see it. I told him I wished he had been the one sitting across from Patricia in a solicitor's office, hearing it said plainly and officially that he had always been right. I told him he had always been right. I stayed until the cold became too much. Then I drove home. And home, for the first time in a long time, was a place I had chosen entirely by myself. The question of my marriage was one I had been circling since the evening Daniel had said the 9 words about having me close. I had been circling it in the way you circle a decision you already know the answer to, but are not quite ready to make final. Daniel had done something during the legal process that I had not expected and had not asked of him. He had given a witness statement to Patricia's office. He had told the truth about what he knew and when he had known it, and what his mother had said to him about our relationship. That testimony had not helped his family's position. It had helped mine. I do not believe he did it solely for my sake. I believe he did it because he had reached the place where one more layer of dishonesty was simply more than he could hold. But he did it. He chose truth at a real personal cost, and I held that. I thought about it, sir. Honestly. And then I asked Daniel for a divorce. Not because love had never been present. Not because I could claim with certainty that everything between us had been false. But because I could not find a path forward that did not require me to walk over the 4 years of knowing and saying nothing. I could not unknow what he had let happen. Every morning he had woken up beside me and chosen, again, not to say a word about the shadow that sat behind his family's property and his father's partnership with mine. That was not one decision. That was 1,000 decisions, made again and again across 4 years, and none of them had been made in my favor. You cannot build something real on a foundation that was never what it was presented as. You can want to. You can sit with a person who is genuinely sorry and feel the sincerity of their regret and still know that regret, however real, cannot restore what the silence cost. Some things, once you know them, cannot be unknown. That is not a failure of forgiveness. It is the honest accounting of what remains. He did not contest the divorce. He agreed to everything I asked. He was calm and cooperative and clearly carried the weight of his own guilt in every conversation we had through that process. I think guilt sometimes gives people the clarity to stop fighting for what they no longer believe they deserve. The fallout after the divorce and the settlement was not clean or simple. Lives rarely resolve into clean endings, and I would not want to tell you that mine did, because then you would know I was giving you a story rather than the truth. Margaret did not face criminal prosecution. The investigation concluded that the evidence directly connecting her to the specific act of filing the forged document in 2001 was insufficient for a criminal charge. That was a painful conclusion. Patricia had prepared me for it, had told me from early on not to build my emotional investment around the criminal outcome, because criminal cases require a very specific and high standard of proof and civil remedies are more predictable. The civil case had been won. My father's name was in the record. The money was real. I chose to let the rest go, not because it did not matter, but because I understood the limits of what I could pursue, and I had already gotten the most important thing. Richard became noticeably less visible in the family business in the months that followed. Elaine told me in one of our occasional careful conversations that there had been significant conflict between him and Margaret, that he had said things she did not easily forgive. I did not ask for details. It was not mine to carry. Elaine herself remained a quiet presence at the edge of my life. We spoke occasionally. She had learned things about her father and her family during this period that had changed her understanding of her own history, and she was working through that in her own private way. I respected it. I did not need her to be my ally or to choose sides openly. I was glad she had chosen honesty, even in the small private way of one message that said, "I believe you." In a period when almost everyone around her was managing and concealing and repositioning, she had simply said something true. I want to tell you about the money, not because the money is what this story was about, but because what I did with it is part of the ending, and the ending matters. After legal fees and taxes, the settlement left me with a little over $1 million. I did not spend it on anything visible. I did not make any move that was about announcement or display or proving something. Those were never the motivations behind any of it. I set aside a portion in a fund in my father's name, not a legal entity, just a sum of money, carefully labeled, that will eventually go toward educational support for young people who need it. My father believed in education with a quiet intensity. He used to say that the only thing you ever own completely is what you understand. He was right. He was right about almost everything. I bought a small house, a modest one, in a neighborhood that is quiet and real in my name alone, something that carries no other person's story, something that cannot be tangled with anyone else's history or concealment or unasked question. When I stand in that house, everything in it is there because I chose it, and I know exactly how it came to be mine. The rest I invested carefully. With a financial advisor, I selected myself, without asking any member of any family for their opinion or their guidance. I was 36 years old. I was alone, and I had more genuine security than I had ever had in my life. And almost all of it had come from my father, who everyone around me had believed had nothing to give. He had given me everything, just not in the way any of us had known. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Daniel sent me a short message. He said he hoped I was doing well. He said he thought about what? Tea had happened often. He said he wished he had been braver sooner. I sat with that message for a few days. I composed my reply carefully and honestly. I said I hoped he was well. I said I believed he had shown genuine courage at a real cost when he gave his witness statement, and I did not take that for granted. I said I wished things had been different from a much earlier point, but I also understood that families like his create the people they create, and that he was not the only architect of the situation we had both ended up inside. He replied once more. He said, "So do I, just those 3 words." That was the last time we spoke. I think about my father most mornings now. I make my coffee, I look out at the quiet street outside my window, and I think about a Tuesday in August 1998, when he drove to the bank and withdrew $87,000 and went to meet his friend and partner to complete the purchase of a property they would build something real with together. I think about the trust in that action. The total and absolute and completely unguarded trust of a man who was incapable of imagining that someone he called his friend would steal from him. I used to think that quality, the depth of that trust, was a kind of vulnerability in him, a blindness, something that had cost him everything and that I should be careful never to replicate. I no longer think of it that way. My father's trust was not a weakness, it was his character. What was done to his trust was a crime, and those 2 things are entirely separate. The crime belongs to the people who committed it. The character belongs to him, belongs to us. I am careful now in ways I was not before. Not closed, not cold. Careful. Being careful means I read documents before I sign them. It means I have a solicitor I call before I make significant decisions, a resource I should have always had access to and now always will. It means I understand that the people who most urgently want you to trust without questioning are frequently the people with the most to lose from your questions. That knowledge is not bitterness. It is just information. And information, placed correctly, is the only real protection anyone has. I am more at peace than I have ever been in my entire life. Peace means the ground under my feet is real. It means nothing I stand on was built on a story someone told me not to look at too closely. It means my father's name is in an official record. It means I stopped waiting for the people who had used my patience as a resource, and I let the truth do its work through the proper channels, slowly and with evidence, and with the extraordinary capability of Patricia Osei, who remains one of the most formidable and precise people I have ever had the privilege of working with. Peace means I sat at my father's grave on a cold afternoon and told him he was right, and I meant every word of it. The last thing I want to leave you with is something about family secrets specifically, because I think it is the thing this whole experience taught me most clearly. Family secrets do not stay still. They do not sit in a box somewhere and wait to be found or forgotten. They expand. They grow into the shape of the family around them. Everyone inside the secret, whether they built it or simply inherited it, is reshaped by it. They learn not to look at certain things. They learn that certain questions are more expensive than the answer is worth. They learn that the family's version of events is the one that keeps the peace, and that the family's version of peace is the one that protects the secret. And so the secret and the peace become the same thing. Margaret built a version of history. James built it first, and she maintained it after him. Richard reinforced it by not looking. Daniel was shaped by it without fully understanding what shape it had made of him. And I walked into the center of it, welcomed warmly, because my presence there was the safest form of management anyone had found for the risk I represented. When I filed those papers, I did not destroy that family. The secret had been destroying them long before I arrived. It had made them smaller than they should have been. It had made their relationships with each other conditional on a shared silence. It had turned a family home into a place where certain questions could never be asked. I did not break any of that. I only made the break that was already there visible. Visibility is the only thing a secret is genuinely afraid of. My father used to say, "Sara, the truth is always in the paper. Always write it down." He was right. The truth was in the paper, and I found it, and it found its way home. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you one more thing before you go. Think about the people in your life who you have trusted most completely. And then ask yourself, honestly, are there questions you have been afraid to ask because asking felt like a betrayal of that trust? Because here is what is. Ara's story taught me, and what I hope it teaches you. Asking the question is not the betrayal. Hiding the answer is. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part of this hit you hardest. And if you know someone who is going through something where they have been silenced by someone they trusted, share this with them. Sometimes the most important thing is to hear that someone else found their documents, asked their questions, and chose themselves anyway.